So we're going to go to Caleb Dalley, who is our research weed scientist at the Hettinger Research Extension Center. And just for those who may be not familiar with North Dakota, since we do have some non-North Dakotans here, since we're on Zoom this year, Hettinger, he's located in the southwest part of the state. So that, Caleb, I see you're up on screen and unmuted, so go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Joe. Okay, I'm going to talk today a little bit about the a trial that Brian Jenks and I have been doing together, looking at fall applications of dicamba and 2,4-D and the tolerance of sunflower, field pea, lentil, and chickpea to these applications. Okay, so when we look at controlling winter annual broadleaf weeds in the spring prior to planting broadleaf crops, it can be somewhat challenging. Some are more difficult to control with glyphosate, whether they are resistant or not, and there is some risk of carryover injury to our spring broadleaf crops when using a broadleaf herbicide. Some broadleaf weeds such as horseweed, prickly lettuce, and narrowleaf hawksbeard, and some of the mustard species can be very difficult to control in crop of our broadleaf crops such as. And so we need to have an effective and inexpensive herbicide that's not going to antagonize glyphosate and won't carry over and cause injury to our spring planted crops. So fall applications of herbicide is another option for controlling these winter annual broadleaf weeds. 2,4-D and dicamba are both very effective at controlling most winter annual broadleaf weeds when applied in the fall. However, if you look at the label, the 2,4-D label says you can plant anything 30 days after application. Dicamba labels aren't as clear, but in general, it's around 120 days after dicamba for all crops. But you also have to consider that degradation of these herbicides are slower when the soil is cold or frozen, and the dicamba label states that you can't count days where the soil is frozen. So it's difficult to determine exactly how many days it's been since the application when you're looking at frozen soil, especially this time of year when everything's frozen. So planting some of these spring broadleaf crops following this fall application of dicamba or 2,4-D can be off-label depending on when the herbicide is applied, how late in the fall, and when the crop is planted in the springtime. So the objectives of this trial was to look at determining the response of these spring crops to fall applications of 2,4-D and dicamba. And we were evaluating injury to sunflower, dry pea, lentil, and chickpea, measuring crop density, crop height, and crop yield as well. The herbicide treatments that were included in this trial were 2 rates of dicamba, the 4 and 8 ounce rate, as well as 2 rates of 2,4-D. In Hettinger, we used the LV6 ester of 2,4-D. In Minot, we used the 4-pound rate, so there's a little bit different rate, but it's the same pounds acid equivalent per acre. And these are all compared to an untreated control for comparison. These trials we have conducted over the last 3 years. I'm going to talk today just about our results from this past year. This past year's results were very similar to what we saw in the previous 2 years. For the environmental conditions at our trial in Hettinger, these treatments were applied in November this past year in 2019. November 19th was very late. We had a very wet fall, and we really couldn't get out in the field any earlier. We had a warm week in middle of November where everything got cleared off enough that we could get out in the field. And so for the environmental conditions, it was 43 degrees, so it wasn't freezing. Even in November, and we had fairly mild winds at 4 miles per hour, and the soil temperature was 35 degrees, so it wasn't frozen at time of application. So we were above freezing. This was very late, and we were hoping to see maybe a little more injury from this later application, and kind of trying to test it out. Normally, you wouldn't put dicamba out this late because most of your weeds will be frozen at that point. But we were just trying to cause some injury and look at possible injury. Next slide. So at Henninger, we planted dry pea and lentil on May 5th and chickpea on May 8th and sunflower on May 28th. And you evaluated injury on May 27th and June 2nd for pea and lentil, and June 2nd and 26th for chickpea and sunflower. We took stand counts on June 10th for all crops using 2 half-meter quadrats for the dry pea, lentil, and chickpea, and we counted all the sunflowers in one row of each plot for sunflower. We also measured crop heights on July 27th using 10 plants per plot as a reference. All crops were harvested using a plot combine with a 5-foot header. Dry peas were harvested on August 7th, lentils on August 12th, chickpeas September 1st. Unfortunately, we were not able to harvest sunflower at the Henninger location due to excessive damage from deer and birds that made it there wasn't enough left of the sunflower to harvest. Next. So looking at crop injury, what we're seeing in general, we had no injury for sunflower, dry pea, or chickpea from either dicamba or 2,4-D. In lentils, we did see injury from primarily dicamba, and we saw that both at the May 27th and June 2nd evaluation. And we saw a little bit more injury with the higher rate of dicamba on May 27th, and it had dropped down a little bit on the June 2nd. For the crop stand at Hettinger, we did not see any difference in crop stand for any of the 4 crops that we evaluated. And we had very good emergence. The only thing that you might look at is the high rate of dicamba on lentil. It was the lowest stand, but it was not significantly reduced. Next. Looking at crop height at Hettinger, we saw no difference in crop height for any of the 4 different crops that were grown at Hettinger. So we didn't see this injury, even with our late application, we didn't see much injury. We didn't see reduction in stand. We didn't see reduction in height. Next. For crop yield, unfortunately, like we said, we couldn't look at crop yield for sunflower at Hettinger, but we did not see any differences in dry pea, chickpea, or lentil yield. If you look at lentil, the high rate of dicamba was our lowest yielding plot. However, the yield was not significantly different than the other treatments. Next. At Minot, we had a very similar trial setup. We used the pint and quart rate of the 4-pound 2,4-D instead of the LV6, but that was the only real difference. Next. At Minot, the treatments were applied on October 8th, so about a month earlier than at Hettinger, using similar procedures to what we had at Hettinger. Crops were planted with dry pea on May 12th, lentil on May 18th, and sunflower on May 27th. And they were harvested on August 5th for dry pea, August 26th for lentil, and we did get harvest yield for sunflower on September 22nd at Minot. Looking at crop injury, it was very similar to what we saw at Hettinger. We didn't have chickpea at Minot. We only had sunflower, dry pea, and lentil, but we didn't see any injury on sunflower or dry pea at the 3 evaluation dates. And for lentil, we had injury at the June 19th and June 29th dates for both 2,4-D and dicamba, but there was no visible injury on July 16th evaluation. And the injury in general was a little bit more with dicamba than what we saw with 2,4-D. Similar to Hettinger at Minot, there was no significant differences in crop stand, except for there was a slight increase in sunflower stand with the low rate of dicamba. It can't. I don't know that we can contribute that to dicamba. It's more likely just variation in the trial that resulted in a little bit higher stand. But for dry pea and lentil, again, we didn't see any differences in stand at all. Similar to Henninger, we did not see any reduction in crop height for sunflower, dry pea, or lentil at any of the rates of dicamba or 2,4-D. So no reductions due to fall carryover in this trial either. Looking at crop yield, we did not see any significant differences in sunflower yield or test weight or percent oil due to fall applications of dicamba or 2,4-D. And if you look at the yield for the high rate of dicamba at 22-26 pounds per acre, it's very similar to the untreated control at 23.72. For dry pea, again, we didn't see any differences in dry pea yield, looking at either test weight or protein or seed yield. And if you look at the high rate of dicamba, 26, it was identical to the yield in the untreated control. In lentil, we had a slight difference in test weight with the high rate of 2,4-D, but it's very similar, still over 60 pounds, and it's something that it's just a slight variation. But we did not see any difference in protein or in seed yield. And the high rate of dicamba, 25-55, was actually higher than what we saw in the untreated control, not significantly, but and all the treatments were very similar to what we saw in the untreated control. So in conclusion, we found that these trials that we conducted in 2019 and 2020 were very similar to what we saw in our previous years. We saw lentil injury at Minot was somewhat greater in 2019 than 2020, but we didn't see any reductions in stand counts or crop heights at either location in any of the years that we conducted these trials. But in 18 and 19, we did not collect yield data. We are going to repeat this trial in 2021. The treatments were already applied last fall, and we're just gonna check it one more time to see if there's any differences this next year. So for fall applications of dicamba 2,4-D, we didn't see any injury to sunflower, dry pea, or chickpea. The injury to lentil from dicamba was visible only for a few weeks after planting and emergence, and we didn't see any losses in crop stand height or yield. Results from this trial indicate that both dicamba and 2,4-D could be used to control winter round broadleaf weeds in the fall prior to planting sunflower, dry pea, or chickpea. When planting lentils, following applications of dicamba, there is a risk for crop injury, and we would be hesitant to recommend planting lentil after using dicamba just because of the injury that we saw, even though we didn't see any significant losses in yield. The ability to apply these herbicides in the fall will help to control these tough annual broadleaf weeds, such as narrowleaf hawksbeard and horseweed that are becoming a bigger problem in our state. Okay, that's all I have, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you guys have.
All right, Caleb, we had a couple questions come in. Looks like one was already answered in the chat box, and then Claire asked a question, which was also answered if you're repeating this trial. The next question we have up is from Philip. He's concerned about overusing 2,4-D with using in burn downs, small grain applications, enlist soybean, etc. Has any work been done with this with other products such as Valor Distinct? He's concerned primarily about pinto beans. So have you looked at other products applied in the fall and being able to plant these other crops in the spring?
We have looked at both Valor and also sulfentrazone in the fall, and I know that Brian's done a lot of other fall herbicide work as well. And So there are other options besides just dicam and 2,4-D Valor, as well as something on the lines of AIM, such as Spartan Charge or something like that in the fall could be effective, but it doesn't have any as long as a residual. But carry over to dry beans, I haven't looked at carry over to dry beans in any of these, but there are other options. And I agree, we can't just use 2,4-D and dicamba always, and it does get used a lot, so it's something that you have to consider.
Yep. All right, and I don't see any other questions coming into the box. So we do have a couple, 2 minutes here, but I think we'll just go ahead and I'll do another housekeeping note and let Harleen get started a little bit early because I think she's got a bunch of pictures to show us for a little sleuthing event here. So one thing I failed to mention at the beginning is I would like to thank HB Sound. So for those who attended Abby Wick's Dirt Workshop or the other things she's doing, the studio behind me looks probably a little familiar. So I want to thank them again for helping us put this event on today.